Right, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Well, welcome back. What I want to do is talk about the life and the murder of the person whom I and many other Ripper researchers regard as being the first victim of Jack the Ripper, and that is a lady known as Martha Tabram. Martha Tabram was born in Southwark in 1869. She was the daughter of Charles White, and the family lived in a house which was about half a mile due south of London Bridge. Charles White was a manager of a local factory. Well, anyway, they were all living there. Martha Tabram, sorry, I should call her Martha White, of course, married at the age of 20 to a man called Henry Tabram, who was a furniture packer. And she settled down in Southwark together, and they started to produce their own family. They had 2 sons, and things went well up until the time when Martha started to have problems with alcohol. And that is a recurrent theme, ladies and gentlemen, going through the whole of the Ripper story. All the victims of Jack the Ripper were prone to alcohol abuse. And indeed, it's still a problem today, of course, with so many people. But of course, on top of that, we have problems now with things like crack cocaine, not only in London, but throughout most large cities throughout the Western world. Anyway, just come back to what we're dealing with. We're dealing with Martha Tabram, Martha White, Martha Tabram, who was living with her husband, a man called Henry Tabram. And I say the marriage fell apart after about 5 years. And they agreed to separate, and Henry Tabram gave Martha a small allowance to live on. But that ceased after about 3 years, when Henry Tabram discovered that Martha was living with another man, another Henry, a Henry Turner. Now, what Henry Turner used to do, he was in the street, basically, what we call a hawker, and he also had a job now and then in carpentry. So the relationship between Henry Turner and this Martha lasted on and off for about 7 years or so, and that fell apart, and eventually more or less for the same reasons, I suppose. They used to see each other off and on. Certainly the relationship had failed by the beginning of 1888, and Martha had gone off to live in Whitechapel, to live in the various doss houses, the common lodging houses, and to support herself by prostitution. The last time that she saw Henry Turner was down at Aldgate. That was on Saturday, the 4th of August, and they met at Aldgate Pump, and Henry Turner gave Martha 1 shilling and 6pence. Now that is 18 pence in the old money. I've got the green signal, so I'll take advantage of it while I've got it. So that was the Saturday. He gave her 1 and 6pence in order to buy stock. He thought she was going to carry on as a hawker, but I don't know what she used it for. She probably used it on drink. Anyway, that was the Saturday. Sunday was the Sabbath, so nothing much happens on the Sabbath. Monday, the 6th of August, was a bank holiday. And on bank holidays, all the bank holidays meant that the banks were shut. And not only were the banks shut, but the factories were shut, the shops were shut, the offices were shut, and ordinary working people had a holiday. One very precious holiday. They actually had 4 bank holidays throughout the year. But it was what remained open, of course, were the pubs and the theatres and the music halls, so you could go out and you could relax and enjoy yourself and have a bit of leisure. Okay, right, now what we're doing is crossing the road since we've got the green signal. And before I go any further, what I want to do is just look back down Whitechapel High Street, just over on the left. You can't really see it. There was a pub there called the White Swan. Now, what happened was that bank holiday evening, Martha met up with a friend of hers, a lady called Mary Ann Nichols, who was 50 years old. She was a big, rather masculine looking woman with a husky voice. She was 50 years old, so she was the senior partner in this little enterprise. But they met up together and they went out to trawl the various pubs in the district. And around about 10 in the evening, they met up in the White Swan with two guardsmen. One guardsman was a corporal, the other one was just a private. But anyway, there were four of them, and they went around and went to various pubs in and around this particular district. And then, at around about midnight, they ended up somewhere around here. Not exactly certain, I can't show you the exact spot, but they agreed at that point to separate. And what happened was that Mary Ann Nichols took her corporal up Angel Alley, which is just directly in front of me, whereas Martha Tabram took her private to George Yard, which is now called Gunthorpe Street. So what we'll do is go up Gunthorpe Street and we'll have a look at the site of George Yard Buildings, which is the site of the place where Martha Tabram was murdered. Okay, so what we're doing, let's make our way around here. This is Gunthorpe Street, and you might like to take note of the fact that these cobbles date from the period of Jack the Ripper. Of course, a lot of other buildings have changed, but this is now called Gunthorpe Street, which is a rather grandiose term. So, housing was a problem in London in those days. London had a population of 5 million. It was growing all the time. You had people coming into London, not only from parts of Europe, but from different parts of the world, as well as parts of Britain. And there was a tremendous pressure on housing. Now, the houses have been built around here. Many of them by this time were 200 years old. The houses had been given over to speculative landlords, and they were being crammed with as many people as you could possibly get. Now, some landlords, some more enlightened people, started to create housing for what they called the respectable poor. What they meant by that was that they would build houses, let them off as apartments, and you could rent if you're a member of the respectable poor. That is, that you're expected to be working in an honest job, regularly employed, so that you could pay your rent on time, and if you couldn't, then you were evicted. If you were married, you had to prove that you were married, otherwise they wouldn't give you room. What else? Oh, you wouldn't be allowed to bring alcohol onto the premises. Doesn't stop you from going down to the pub, but you don't bring alcohol onto the premises, and you don't use your flat for any immoral purpose. Now, what I'm showing at the present moment is the building that went up on the site of George Yard Buildings. George Yard Buildings was actually pulled down in the 1960s and is probably not sorry that it's gone. These are really rather pleasant as a replacement, but this has got really nothing to do with the murder of Martha Tabram other than being on the site, but we can't really pinpoint the exact point where Martha Tabram was murdered. So let's just move on, and we'll talk about that particular incident as we go forward into Wentworth Street. Now, Wentworth Street still has the name which it had all those years ago. And, as I say, Martha Tabram had brought her young private somewhere around here. We don't know. We assume it must have been into George Yard buildings around about midnight. At about let's think, about 4:45. We're talking about 4:45. A young man called John Reeves, who lived right at the very top of George Yard buildings on the 3rd floor. He came down 2 flights of stairs, only to be confronted on the 1st floor landing with the body of a woman, face up, lying in a pool of blood, with her skirt up around her waist. And when he got over the shock, he came running out here into the street, into Wentworth Street. Let me point out and show you Wentworth Street is this street. I dare say these sets are original, but of course much has changed. He found a police officer. The police named the police officer was Thomas Barrett, and they went straight back to the site of the murdered lady. And then what Thomas Barrett did was tell Reeves to go off and fetch Dr. Killeen from his address in Brick Lane, not so very far from here. So anyway, Killeen came along here. Dr. Killeen came along to tend to the body. This would all have been about 5:30 when he arrived, and of course John Reeves then excused himself because he had to get to work. His work was as a waterside labourer in the docks, so he left the scene, and it was up to Thomas Barrett, the police officer, and also to the doctor to organise the transfer of the body from George Yard buildings to the mortuary in Old Montague Street. You can't see it from here. I'll take you down there a little while to show you Montague Street. But anyway, that's what they did. They got rid of. They took the body out to the mortuaries, where Dr. Killeen started to conduct the autopsy on Martha Tabram. And while he was doing this autopsy, then down here, while he was conducting the autopsy, he got a photographer. Before really did anything else, he got a photographer to take a photograph of the deceased so they could use her for identification purposes. They had no idea what her name was. He then started to conduct the autopsy. He concluded that the lady had been killed. She had first of all been strangled, and also she had been killed by a stab to the breastbone, the chest, with a long broad-bladed knife, possibly a dagger. They later thought it was a bayonet. But more than this, what struck them as very unusual was that there were 38 other stab wounds to the torso, given by a very much smaller knife. Now, normally murderers don't go on to that extent, so clearly the murderer must have been mentally deranged to actually want to start committing these atrocities on the body. So that gave people an idea that there was something radically wrong with what was going on. So we're talking about Tuesday, and we're talking about the press getting involved, and they're starting to write up the story about this hideous murder of this lady who had not only been strangled and had her stabbed in the chest, but she'd also had to suffer the indignity of another almost 40 other stab wounds. The police realised, so the man who was really the Detective Inspector Edmund Reed was the man who was really responsible for the detective work in Whitechapel at the time. And he realised he was going to have a problem, because it's always a problem when you have serial murders. The murder of a stranger, most murders take place within the family or among friends, and you can actually work out pretty quickly who the murderer was, but not in these cases. There was going to be a lot of work. What they did is to go and start talking to other residents of George Yard buildings to find out what they knew. And first of all, they spoke to a family called Mahoney. That's a couple, Joseph and Elizabeth Mahoney, who said that they had returned to George Yard Buildings at 1:40 in the morning. And then very shortly afterwards, Elizabeth Mahoney just slipped out into the street here. She was only gone about 10 minutes, quarter an hour at the very most, to just get some food to make a light supper before they went to bed. Anyway, they were in bed at 2:30. They said they heard nothing at all. It was all dark by that time. What they did is they turned off the gas light at 11 p.m. in George Yard Buildings so that any of the tenants would have to stumble around, and if Martha had been murdered at that time, they would certainly have stumbled over the body, so the murder can't have taken place any time before 2:30. They then spoke to another man called George Crowe, and George Crowe talked about returning to George Yard Buildings at 3:30. And when he did that, he noticed as he was walking up the stairs, there was a body that was lying on the landing. It was all dark. He wasn't aware whether the person was dead or whether she was drunk, possibly a homeless person who was just seeking some accommodation just for the night. And that determined the fact the time of death must have been around about 3 o'clock, give or take half an hour on either side. Dr. Colleen himself, as I say, he arrived at 5:30. He deduced that the murder must have taken place about 3 hours before. It's sort of 2:30, somewhere between 3. Now that means actually that it doesn't necessarily have to be the private, the guardsman. It's quite possible Martha had enough time, having finished with him, to go out into the street and seek another client. And her problem was that she bumped into Jack the Ripper, and that was really the end of her, which was all rather gruesome. But anyway, there we are. What we'll do is move on. What I'd like to do is take you up Wentworth Street, and I'd like to talk a bit about the way they established the identity of Martha Tabram. Just cross over here. And also I want to show you this neighbourhood. So where are we now? We're talking about Wednesday. Now, the policeman who attended to Martha Tabram, Thomas Barrett, he remembered that at 2 in the morning he was speaking to a guardsman, and he said, just who was loitering around, he said, "What were you doing?" And the guardsman said he was just waiting for a chum who'd gone with a girl. So he told him to move on, but then that aroused his suspicions that the murderer was one of the guardsmen, or was a guardsman. And so he went down to the Tower of London the following day with Edmund Reed to inspect an identification parade that had been put up. That was the first identification at the Tower of London. That's where the guards from the Grenadier Guards were stationed. So Thomas Barrett had an inspection of the guards who were presented to him, and identified 2 young men, but both of them had perfect alibis, so that didn't really take them very much further. So what are we talking about? We're now talking about Wednesday. And if you'll excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, I must consult my notes, because I want to be absolutely certain I get my facts straight. Not that I don't know them, but it means that you never know when things can get distracting. Right, so we talked about Wednesday. We talked about Barrett going down to the Tower of London and having an unsuccessful identification parade. Thursday morning, Mary Ann Connolly turned up at the police station. She came to complain about a man she called the Leather Apron. The Leather Apron was going around assaulting prostitutes and robbing them of their money. And she responded, I say, the thing is why the police started taking an interest in her and saying, well, if you are out on the Monday evening, you can help us with an identification parade. She was reluctant to do this because she didn't want to get the reputation of being the sort of person who would publicly identify her clients. So anyway, she did this with very great reluctance. So on the Thursday afternoon, the inquest into the death of Martha Tabram opened at the Working Lads Institute in Whitechapel Road. That's opposite the London Hospital. And what they did is they took evidence from the residents at George Yard Buildings. They also took evidence from P.C. Barrett and Edmund Reed. They all gave evidence. And still at that time, there was still the mystery to know the name of the woman. Martha at that time was calling herself Emma, so that didn't help. That's quite usual. Many of the prostitutes in this area use all sorts of aliases. Quite possible that her surname, well, she was using several surnames, Turner, Tabram, or even Stapleton. So all these names were published in the papers, and they fixed up an ID parade for Mary Ann Connolly at the Tower of London. That was the second ID parade, and she failed to appear. So having fixed up the ID parade, they just had to abandon it. They couldn't find out where this woman had gone to, and they had to spend the entire rest of the day and the weekend searching for her. They eventually found her in Covent Garden. Now what I've done here, I've just arrived at the crossroads. That's Wentworth Street. Ahead of us is Old Montague Street. Over on my left hand side is Brick Lane leading northwards, and over on my right hand side is Osborn Street going southwards. And actually, if you look down Osborn Street, you go down all the way to the Whitechapel Road. We've been there, but I won't go there just at this moment. What I propose to do is go forward. I was telling you about the failure of the second identification parade at the Tower of London, and they put up a third one, and Mary Ann Connolly went and had a close inspection of the guards, and then she came up with the information that the guardsman that she had been entertaining on the Monday evening had a white band in his cap, and that indicated that he was not a member of the Grenadier Guards, but of the Coldstream Guards. And the Coldstream Guards were not stationed at the Tower of London, they were stationed at the Wellington Barracks, and the Wellington Barracks is down by Buckingham Palace. Anyway, by this time, the information had got out into the newspapers, and on the Monday evening, Henry Tabram, who was then at that time living in Greenwich, picked up the paper and realised that story about the murder, which was a sensation at the time, and the victim might have been called Martha, she might have been called Emma. Her surname might have been Turner or Tabram or Stapleton or something else, and he thought he'd better come along to the police, so he did that the following day, the Tuesday morning. And what he did then was go down to the mortuary and identify the body of Martha Tabram. So it's all very sad. So on Wednesday the 15th, they organised the fourth identification parade at the Wellington Barracks this time for Mary Connolly, and as usual, Mary Connolly was very half-hearted about giving any help to the police. she managed to pick out 2 of the guardsmen, and it turned out as well that they had cast iron alibis for the night in question. So by that time the police decided to give up on this idea of thinking that the murderer was a guardsman. And also it occurred to them, or at least it occurred to somebody, that the knife, for example, they thought was a bayonet. That's why they thought it was most likely to be a guardsman. But bayonets or daggers or anything could be purchased quite easily in any of the second-hand shops around here, or indeed in the street markets. So that meant that they just simply had to open a file. They eventually concluded the inquest with the verdict that the murder was committed by a person or persons unknown, and that's where it had to stay for a while. We've been talking about this, and as I say, we have just worth talking now why it is that Ripper researchers think that she was actually a Ripper victim, and I think that comes down simply to the fact of the savagery of the attack on her body. Jack the Ripper was more usual to actually rip the body, the torso open. He didn't do so on this occasion. He didn't cut the throat. But the attack on Martha Tabram was savage, and for that reason they do think that she was actually the first of the victims. Not everyone agreed with that at the time. And it's, I suppose, still an open question. Now what I want to do is go forward now, and I want to talk a bit about the common lodging houses. Now a common lodging house was simply a house that had been converted into a place where people could stay for the night for a charge of about 4p. What you got for that was just a bed. There were no sanitary facilities in these places. There was also usually a kitchen in the common lodging houses where you could, if you brought your own food, you could cook it, and that became something of a social centre as well. There were several of these, but there tended to be a place where you would get thieves and prostitutes. And also you'd be turned out at about 10 in the morning, so if you were sick, that would just be your bad luck. You'd be wandering around the streets sick, and you wouldn't be allowed back into the common lodging house until early evening. Turn around here. What I'm now looking at is the site of what used to be George Street, and you can't really, I don't think you can read it very well here, but it says, erected here by the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company, 1886. Now the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company were people who created these affordable accommodation for poor people, and they had their own premises in Flower and Dean Street. This is all changed, as you can imagine. I think these houses went up in the 1980s. They're quite agreeable actually to live in, I'm sure, and probably occupied, I would think, by people who have been living in the City of London. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is just talk a bit about the preliminary. I'll talk more about Mary Ann Nichols and her life and death a bit later on, but since we're here, Mary Ann Nichols, who used to call herself Polly Nichols, spent 7 years, that's from 1881 to 1888, in the Lambeth workhouses. In May of 1888, she found employment as a maid in a house in Wandsworth, run by a couple who were teetotal, and so they wouldn't allow alcohol on the premises. Mary Ann Nichols was in the job for about 6 weeks or so, then she absconded with a large quantity of clothes which she stole, and then headed straight here to Whitechapel. She shared a room at a place called Wilmot's in Thrawl Street. Thrawl Street has now disappeared. I think I can point out the line of Old Thrawl Street. She stayed there with 3 other women. She was there for a little while, and then on Friday the 24th she moved to another address, number 56 Flower and Dean Street, where the regulations were much slacker, and they would allow her to bring in guests and use the place for the evening to entertain. Anyway, making our way down here, formerly we'd be going down George Street, and I say this is not George Street anymore, this is quite a different place. You probably wouldn't want to be here at this time of day. You probably wouldn't want to be here, certainly in the dead of night. But today it's quite different. As I say, it's quite a pleasant residential area, and you can even bring up children around here. Now, Thrawl Street, once upon a time, have occupied this, or somewhere around here, going to the right and to the left down Commercial Street. I want to go ahead because I want to head down into what is now called a place called Loleworth Close. And Loleworth Close, once upon a time, was Flower and Dean Street. It was regarded as the most notorious part of this area way back in Jack the Ripper's day. So Loleworth Close is just directly in front of us, and as we make our way down here, you can see up here, just pointing over the roofs, the spire of Christchurch Spitalfields, and I'll talk more about that in a future video, but let's just do one thing at a time. Flower and Dean Street connected Commercial Street with Brick Lane. And Flower and Dean Street, I think, was built in the late 1600s. It was pretty well all given over to common lodging houses. Many of them were extremely disreputable. And the place, I'm glad to say, has all been pulled down. It was pulled down many decades ago. But anyway, this is Loleworth Close. And I rather suspect we're not actually standing in what used to be the line of Old Flower and Dean Street, but probably if we were here before the houses were knocked down, we might be in the backyard, if not in the house itself. Anyway, why I've brought you down here is because Martha Tabram and Mary Ann Nichols were staying at common lodging houses in George Street and Thrawl Street. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes lived in Flower and Dean Street, and ahead of us, you can't really see it, but if you go further forward out into Commercial Street, turn around the corner to the right and then turn left into White's Row, you come very near, close to Dorset Street, where you had Annie Chapman living there, and not so far away, Mary Jane Kelly. So I'm talking about all 6 victims living in a neighbourhood very, very close to each other. They were all engaged in the same sort of activity, and my guess is that they actually were acquainted with each other. We don't know how well acquainted, but they must have had some level of acquaintance. Now, a professor at the University of Texas in 2006 studied serial murders where the murderer lived in connection to where the murders took place. And he got all that information, and he constructed a very highly complex mathematical formula which was then fed into a computer. And when somebody from the Metropolitan Police got hold of this information, what they did is project it all onto a map of this district, and they came to the conclusion that Jack the Ripper lived in Flower and Dean Street. Just turn around here to show you Loleworth Close. Or he may have lived in Thrawl Street, just a bit further up, or he may have lived in Fashion Street, which is now behind me. I'm just turning around to the right, I'm heading southwards. And what I'm going to do is make my way into Brick Lane. So, I just find that rather interesting. I intuited that Jack the Ripper lived in the centre of the murder district, in the immediate vicinity of the crossroads that I was talking about. But somebody has been even more scientific than myself, and they have come to the conclusion that Jack the Ripper lived in Flower and Dean Street. Well, I find that interesting, ladies and gentlemen. It is quite possible that I can be wrong. I've been doing the job of guiding people around here now for about 10 years, and I say I've done it long enough to know that I learn new things. And if you do that, sometimes you have to completely revise everything you ever thought about the murders. But I do find it interesting that although they have a different location, those two locations, those two epicenters, if you like, of Jack the Ripper's activity were not so very far apart from each other. And it comes back to the same conclusion. Jack the Ripper was a local man living somewhere very close to this place that I'm now revealing to you, all those years ago, 140 years ago, or at least the best part of 140 years. Now what we're in Brick Lane at the present moment, and what I'm showing you is Brick Lane. Brick Lane, as the name suggests, goes back many hundreds of years. In the late 1400s they were producing bricks and tiles here, and then it really started to be built over in the mid 18th century. And as we look up Brick Lane, you can see a very tall metallic structure. That is the minaret of the Brick Lane Mosque. Now that was opened in 1743 as a Huguenot chapel. So it was built originally for Christian worship, and it served the Huguenot community of this particular part of London for many generations. Eventually the Jews moved in here in the mid 19th century, and they took over Brick Lane, and it became a synagogue after that. And so after being a Christian church, it became a synagogue. And then slowly the Jews started to move out, and as the Jews started to move out, the Bengalis moved in, and they've taken over this place now, and it's very famous for Bengali cuisine. So you've got a wide selection of Bengali restaurants. Just a little bit further up, I think, where you can see just leading off on the right hand side, would have been the home, the house and the surgery of Dr. Killeen, the man who attended to the body of Martha Tabram. Here, very interestingly, we have Chinese takeaway, or is it at the heart of Indo-Chinese food? Right, I'll just go round here because I want to step back a bit and show you all the way up here. You can't read it, I'm afraid, it's all faded. It used to say the Frying Pan. There was a pub here called the Frying Pan, and I call it to your attention because this is where Mary Ann Nichols was on the night of, or the evening I should say, of Thursday the 30th of August. She'd spent her time in here, she spent her money in here. She must have drunk 8 glasses of gin. She said later to a friend that she'd had her DOS money, that's 4pence, 3 times over, so she must have earned a shilling from 3 separate clients. But she'd spent it all on drink. She'd squandered it all on drink, and she was entirely penniless. Anyway, she went back to her lodgings. They wouldn't in Thrawl Street, Wilmots. They wouldn't let her in because she didn't have any money. She sat in the kitchen for a while, but they then said they wouldn't let her in, so she just had to wander around the street. What she told the deputy, the man who was running the DOS house, the common lodging house, not to let the bed because she'd soon be back. She had a new bonnet, and she was very proud of that and was quite satisfied that she would get a client very, very soon. So she was wandering around here through these streets for about an hour after she left the Doss house. Obviously she didn't pick up anybody at that time, and she just headed down here eventually towards the Whitechapel Road, where there was a bit more traffic, and the chances are of getting a client were rather more favourable. Now at that time, we're talking about Thursday the 30th of August of 1888, there was a very serious, a huge fire in the Docklands. It was enormous, caused a great deal of damage, and on all these occasions it drew very large numbers of people who came along to have a look at the fire. Mary, of course, Ann Nichols missed all that. She was hanging around in the pub all the time. Actually, it had been raining very, very badly. The people who were watching the fire were just standing around getting wet. Anyway, that doesn't put people off from watching a fire if that's the sort of entertainment they have. Oh, that's the Hampton by Hilton there on the left. It's a much smarter place to live. This is, of course, London has now so many hotels for people that so many people, visitors coming into London. Some very smart hotels, and the Hampton by Hilton is one of them. Right, well, we'll just head down here because I'm just going to wind up very, very shortly. She met, as she came down here, she met a lady called Emily Holland. Now, she knew Emily Holland from the Doss house she'd been staying in. Emily Holland had been out to watch this fire, and she was making her way back home, and she bumped into Mary Ann Nichols on the corner of Osborn Street and the Whitechapel Road, according to the testimony that she gave. So that must have been around about here. And what Emily Holland tried to do was entreat Mary Ann Nichols to come back. But she said she had no money. She had to go and look for a client to get the money. So eventually they parted company, 2:30, and then Mary Ann Nichols wandered off in the general direction of Mile End, which is in that direction. So I'll talk more about the life and death of Mary Ann Nichols in the next video. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Over and out.